pointed out in the beginning, some of the new kind of pioneering ideas that we've recently launched. We'll walk you through that, but maybe also a quick update on where MIQ stands. If any of you have any questions, including during the presentation, then don't hesitate to put it on the chat group or shout out. I think this should be the sharing. Let me just test that. Is that correct? Carolina or Ben, can you confirm I am sharing the right screen? Okay, good. So what we'll do is, well, first of all, I think, and this is really key, is in the space of less than 18 months, we've managed to certify, and I'll go into the concept of what certifying means exactly, because that is key, 170 BCM of gas a year. It represents about 4% of global gas supply, and about almost 20% now of US gas supply. And as you know, US gas supply is enormous. It's between 900 and 1,000 BCM, depending on the year and the specifics. But this is a huge quantity, clearly. I think it's also a very interesting quantity because it's even a bit more than the Russian gas that's clearly not coming to Europe anymore. But anyway, it puts it in a perspective. And that's in less than 18 months. And we do speak quite a lot to people on the Silicon Valley side, and even they have to admit this is a stellar growth. And I think there's several reasons why that stellar growth has taken place, because that number was zero when we last time presented on this forum. And so in total, there's now about close to 5,000 BCF of gas that is certified as each month more rolls upon on this. And you see there some of the companies that are participating. Well, again, I'll go into detail what participating means, because we certify on an asset level. We don't certify a company. An asset, you have to think the basin operated by such a company. And so what it means, there's huge availability of certified gas. So credible gas with low methane emissions attached to that. And we've done this by not making MIQ the limit to the growth. In a way, we've designed an ecosystem, a framework. Sometimes you could call it even in a way, it's obviously in the official name, it would be a standard, a universal standard, and you could even call it a framework, a language that people can rally behind. And we're working with a huge amount of companies. And there's three parts which are key here. On the left, you see the independent auditors. MIQ is a strong believer that if you want to do methane emissions properly, you actually need experts to verify, check, audit, go on the fields to check what's happening out there, because it's still, some of it is emerging, and it requires the quality of people. You can't just take data from a data system and call it, here is the number, like we see with so many data and tech companies approach. We believe that the auditor here is key, the human being, with all the knowledge attached to it. And you see some very large companies we are working with. Then the second part is obviously the methane tech. We've listed there a variety of companies that we are working with. In total, there's about 30-ish of them, and it goes from really small startups to fast-growing, medium-sized companies, and some of these names might be familiar, such as, I don't know, Bridger or Kuva or Longpath, obviously Schlumberger. Do I get a question there? No? Okay. And some of them are also part of the larger companies. So you've got Sufi and Schlumberger are much larger companies that are participating. And then obviously the operators themselves, they need to volunteer to be certified. So just to be clear, this is not a regulatory framework. This is a voluntary certification. Now, we have designed it such that if the regulators wish to adopt this, it's actually quite straightforward. It can be integrated into legislation or picked up, and there's a variety of precedents for this. It's an open system. It's very transparent. All the standards are out there on our website. How does it work in practice? We work per facility. So for facility, think all the assets of an operator in a specific basin, and that can be offshore, onshore, that can be LNG liquefaction, it can be pipelines, it can be anything. At the moment, it's mainly upstream in the US, but the whole system has been designed for global adoption, the full supply chain. So the key here is that with the help of the standard, the standard you have to think that's a document about 100 pages, the auditor gets contracted by the operator and takes about 1 to 2 to 3 months to do the full audit of the facility. And ultimately, then the facility in question will get a grade, A, B, C, D, E. And obviously, this being Europe, we're all familiar with the energy labels on appliances, and it's very similarly that we have designed this. A is better than B, and so on. Quite a lot of elements go in there, which is methane performance, methane intensity, the use of technology, but I'll spare you the details here for this purpose. But what's key is there's a grading going in, which is related to the methane intensity. And then in step 2 is that from there on, for a year, in total, the operator on a monthly basis, they have to provide us data. That data gets checked, and that's called issuing, and they will then get certificates. They will get certificates per MMBTU, 1 certificate per MMBTU, and it will state again the grade, the methane intensity on there. That means that the operator can now transact this with the buyers. I'm assuming there's several of you here who are buyers of gas or traders of gas. So you can buy the physical gas, but now with the attributes of the methane emissions attached to that, because the certs can follow the flow. It can be detached, can be together, but it represents the methane emissions of this. Then as a buyer, you can now use these, and you know finally, because you didn't do it before, the scope 3 emissions, including the methane. And then there's a process called retirement. This is all managed via a registry, and we've created one with another organization called MIQ-registry.org. And if you look up on it, you will see all the facilities that have been certified. That's public knowledge in the sense of showing the transparency. Now, what have we done as well, very excitingly, is very recently my science and technology team has done a lot of research together with another organization called Highwood. And we've dug into the average national US emissions. And if you look at the numbers here, what's interesting about it is this is the first time there's included a huge amount of measurements into deriving this number here. So you see it on the right there is more than 300,000 measurements that have been included. And as you're probably aware, previously a lot of it was based on theoretical calculations. Most other countries, it's all theoretical calculations, extrapolations, spreadsheets. Basically, we don't know very much, to be blunt. But with this here, we feel as an organization, and the paper is published on the internet, you can download it from our website again if you want to read the detail. But the conclusions are quite interesting in a way, because what this shows is that the average US production number is 1% leakage, is give or take double of what the government figures would show in the US, and it's 2.2% across the full supply chain. Again, roughly double of what official EPA numbers or similar models would show you. And here's an interesting one for the Europeans. So it is 2.2% average leak. Now, that's before it goes into the LNG liquefaction chain. So you then have to add the methane emissions from the liquefaction, from the shipping, and from the regas. And obviously they vary depending on the ship, depending on the facility, and so on. And we'll be looking into determining that as averages as well. But you can see that you get closer to 3%. And why is 3% key? 3% is kind of give or take the switch over. So if gas leaks 3%, it is in emissions, CO2e emissions, around the same intensity now as coal. And so that doesn't look that good. Now, however, this is the average. In the previous slide, I was showing you this one here, this one actually rather, that there is 170 BCM of gas that is certified in the US, which is actually low methane emissions, because that's been certified as an A grade, B grade, or a C grade in our system. So that's less than 0.2%. And that 0.2%, you have to compare that with the 1.0% there. So it's a tale of two sides, like glass half full, glass half empty. So On the one side, the average emissions are quite high, and I'm sure if we start rolling these out in other countries, we'll come to similar types of conclusions probably. But there is also a lot of very low methane emissions gas that's now been credibly certified that is available. And so how do you determine your methane reductions then? And it's kind of simple in this kind of worked example. Let's say somebody would buy B-grade production inside the US. That would be a 0.1% versus the MIQ Highwood index of 1.0%. The emissions reductions are now 0.9%. And so you see there the numbers below there in grams per MMBTU, both CH4 and CO2e. It's staggering numbers, basically. And this is actually something that buyers can do today, and several have done in the US are starting to do these actions of buying this. Interestingly enough, in this example, we've still used the 100-year conversion for methane, which is, in my view, very conservative. One should use really the 20-year one. Another interesting question that we often get asked, but what's the cost of buying this certified gas? So in the US currently, I mean, we are not party of the markets, but from what we can see, it's anywhere between 1 and 7 cents, and it varies, of course, and markets will change over time, and it's very early day. So we've worked out an example here at 2 cents per MMBTU premium for B grades, what that cost is in dollars per CO2e. And we're now comparing different systems of addressing greenhouse gases. They're obviously not 100% comparable and have slightly different effects, but it does show you the potential and the cost effectiveness of buying certified gas versus some of the alternatives. And again, this calculation has been done with using the 100-year GWP for the top number of $4.70 per CO2e. If you now use the number of over the 20 years, so 80 times, then that cost drops to $1.50 roughly, which is give or take 10 times lower than the next example that we're showing here. Why is supply chain certification so key, and the concept of certificates? Because we believe it's the only viable solution for Scope 3 reporting, CBAM, or import standards. And maybe walk you through why that is the case. When you import diesel or oil, you can clearly measure the density of the sulfur at the border. Just put a dipstick into the ship, and there you go, and you measure it. But that's not possible with methane emissions, or in general with emissions, because they've gone. How are you going to measure it as the gas arrives in Europe? You just can't do it. When the LNG ship arrives in Europe, you can't. It's a guesstimate there. So the supply from the ship, from what the ship is giving you. So the solution is through supply chain certificates, where you get certificates delivered with the gas, because it contains the audited attributes of the GHG emissions upstream. And so the other advantage of it is that it's unlike a reporting standard or desktop LCA analysis, which is highly theoretical. You actually get the certificates together with the gas. They're audited and they avoid double counting, because you get the certificate. Once you, as the buyer, you have the certificate with the gas, nobody else can use it anymore, and that's managed by the registry. And so the buyers can be assured of the Scope 3 emissions you are reporting, whilst otherwise it's actually a theoretical exercise, and a lot of double counting and double claiming could be happening. So here you see it worked out again. And so with MIQ, we've kind of created a universal standard for supply chain emissions, because an interesting one that we've added versus last time we spoke, and this is mainly to deal with what's happening in the LNG chain, is we've added CO2 and N2O as well. And so there's in total of about 7 stages of the gas supply. Not only can you then get the methane emissions, but also the CO2 and nitrous oxide. And so it gives you a total GHG picture. But again, it's audited and it's certified, and it avoids a double counting. And that's what you can achieve with certificates and certifications. And I often hear people saying, oh, supply chain emissions, it's so difficult. And I disagree. I think actually with the system we have devised here, which is, again, totally transparent, and you can download all the documents on the internet and the registry, it's actually quite straightforward to do this. So my view tends to be, let's all get on with it, rather than keep talking about what the concept should be. Just a worked example here. This is a real case of a US hydrogen buyer that's been consuming gas for hydrogen production, actually that then gets converted into ammonia. So they get different certificates for the different parts of the supply chain, an A grade for the onshore production, which represents around 10 grams per MMBTU of methane leaks, and so on. And basically what we do via the supply chain accounting is we add up all these methane intensities via the certificates, because the certificates state the actual maximum, by the way, intensity attached to that specific facility. What you see on the right side as well is that all means it's a scope 1 that's being addressed by the producers or the operators, but obviously for you as a buyer, that represents your scope 3. And again, you get your scope 3 emissions represented and audited. And here's a case worked out for what it would look like for Europe. Similar numbers gives you the methane intensities by adding the different numbers across the supply chain. So again, it works for an import standard, works with trading, works with scope 3 accounting. And yeah, those are a couple of the developments. And as we said earlier, Ben, he's our policy director and very active in the US policy land. So also wanted to speak a bit about that because I think it will have relevance for Europe as things develop. Ben, over to you.
Looks like a question came up in the chat.
I didn't see that, sorry.
Asking about some more background on the methane intensity index and how that 1% and 2.2% numbers were generated.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it would be slightly passing this, let's say, the purpose of this call, because we'd have to go really into the details. It's partially based on there's about 6 or 7 basins where research has been done, and that includes measurements in those regions, and that is principally flyovers that have been used for those 367,000 measurements that were determined. But that's only partially of what it is in the US, of course. And then what the teams have done is from there, and then from the other data we have on the other basins, determine extrapolations on how to then push that into other basins. And it's really a question of determining whether you have gas-rich or oil-rich and making the splits there appropriately to then come to a US national conclusion. So one of the downsides of working with large numbers and statistics is that what we can't do with this index is go more in a granular level, for example, of the second part of the supply chain. So we've given the 1.0% number for upstream. We're very confident on splitting that up. And then it's 2.2% for the full supply chain, or in other words, 1.2% for the non-production part. But what we can't do, where we don't feel sufficiently confident, is then to say, okay, that means this percentage for pipelines and that percentage for boosting and gathering. So that's one of the limitations of this approach that we've taken. So we've stopped where we felt we are very confident of the way of the statistics works and the measurements, and basically the statistics work out. What I do recommend, if you want to dig more into it, it's downloadable on our website, www.miq.org. I'm happy to set up a conversation with our director of science and tech. She's super excited about this whole work. And including, if it's of interest for more people, then we can organize a separate session on this as well.
Right. Okay, so once again, Ben Webster, Director of Policy for MIQ. What I'm going to do is walk through a few slides regarding developments in the U.S. policy space. Before we do that, just want to comment on this picture. This is a somewhat recent photograph of a oil and gas production site in the Front Range of Colorado, and that is the area close to Denver. And what you can see here are a few interesting things that I think really helps explain the development of policy in the U.S. Here you have one of the parts of the country, one of the parts of the U.S. where we've seen extremely rapid development and growth. This is one of the fastest growing residential areas within the US, up north and south along the eastern edge of the Rockies, north and south of the city of Denver. That development sits on one of the most productive natural gas deposits or basins in the country. And so what you see here is a natural gas production site, which is proximate to a residential area. The result of that, probably really starting in 10, 13 years ago, was a series of fairly high conflict situations between oil and gas developers and communities, both individuals as well as city governments. As a result, the state of Colorado has found itself in the position of having to negotiate these conflicts. And as a result of that, the state of Colorado has become really a national leader in terms of the development of regulations, bringing in a variety of stakeholders, citizens groups, environmental NGOs, oil and gas companies, state regulators, to come up with some fairly progressive regulations that allow for oil and gas development, but with certain protections in place. The other thing of note about this, and one of the another driving element, you can see in the background of this picture, it's very hazy. And of course, with oil and gas development, we often see the release of, in addition to methane, other volatile organic compounds, which are ozone precursors. And so that haze is effectively a smog or a high ozone day. And that public health from an air point of view has been another major driver of regulations in this state. And as I'll talk about in a few minutes, a phrase that's used in the US is that the states are laboratories of democracy. And in that sense, the states often come up with regulations or policies which are then picked up by other states and the US federal government. We can go to the next slide, please. So what I want to do here is share two slides. This first one on US federal or national policy initiatives. The second will be on state initiatives. I think that there are two takeaways here. The first is that the policy landscape at the federal level is very active right now. And there are a number of different policy initiatives which are in development in the US. And I think that these can be tracked across or grouped into a variety of areas. The first are technology regulations, the second, performance regulations, the third, reporting measures, and the fourth, funding opportunities. So in addition to this being a very active policy space, there are a variety of different types of policies. So on the technology regulations front, or in that bucket per se, we have a number of different agencies: the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Interior's Bureau of Land Management, and the Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA, are all developing regulations which put controls on elements of the natural gas infrastructure system. So, for example, the US EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has submitted proposed regulations which will put in place technology controls with regards to flaring, with regards to pumps requiring zero-emission pneumatic pumps, amongst a variety of other areas. On the PHMSA side, the Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, controls are being put in with regards to a variety of natural gas pipelines, including gathering pipelines. So those are might be viewed as more traditional regulatory command control type systems, providing instructions to operators about how and what type of technologies should be used. The second category are performance regulations. Everyone will be, I think, familiar at this point in time with the, this should say the Inflation Reduction Act, not the Inflation Re-Education Act, although maybe that's what will be happening. The Inflation Reduction Act includes a methane fee, and this is a very new, I think, an innovative and potentially effective policy mechanism, which will call for a fee or tax to be applied for methane emissions above a certain threshold. This has been enacted by law, but proposed regulations have not been released yet. The third element are reporting measures. We see a variety of those in a more formal sense. The Securities and Exchange Commission is currently developing regulations on required greenhouse gas reporting measures for Scope 1 and Scope 2. Whether those include Scope 3 reporting is to be determined. That is going to be a function of that we will find that out when the rules are released. In a similar vein, the Department of Energy, Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, which has some jurisdictional authority with regards to LNG shipments or LNG exports, is currently collecting information on LNG emission measures and what might be done to reduce methane emissions with LNG shipments. While that is not a required regulatory effort, it is, I think, indicative that a number of federal agencies are collecting information to drive future policies. And fourth, on the funding front, once again, in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, we see a dedicated amount of money, $1.5 billion in technology assistance to operators to reduce methane emissions. So what we have here are performance measures, command control technology efforts, reporting requirements, as well as funding opportunities amongst the various tools that the US federal government is putting forth to control methane emissions. We can go to the next slide, please. So on the state front, there are a number of different initiatives in place. I divide these up into what I refer to as supply side regulations, passive demand side regulations, and active demand side regulations. And these three categories really give an interesting view of the different approaches and tools that are being used by states to control methane emissions across the country. On the supply side, going back to our earlier picture, the state of Colorado has put in place probably the most progressive and innovative regulations across the entire United States, putting into effect the first emissions intensity regulations for oil and gas operators. These are currently in effect, and the state of Colorado is developing regulations as we speak on how operators can verify their emissions intensity claims. So the entire country, I think, is looking towards the state of Colorado in terms of how these emissions intensity regulations are going to do towards achieving the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals. New Mexico is also another state leader. On the demand side, from a passive perspective, the states of Virginia and Tennessee have put forward new state laws passed last year in 2022 that instructs the local state regulatory authorities, the public utility commissions that provide oversight over energy utilities, to instruct their utility commissions to allow for low emission gas to be considered as part of the fuel portfolios that utilities in those states can consider. Because there is a cost increase, albeit a very small one, for the use of low emission or certified gas, the public utility commissions have to sign off on that increase in, or that have to sign off on that more expensive fuel. So what that effectively means is in Virginia and Tennessee, the consumers and utilities now have more choices in terms of the fuel mix that are used to power the state, both commercially and residentially. Now, in California, I think that we have one of the most innovative policies currently being considered. The state of California, which is the second largest user of natural gas in the United States, is currently considering state legislation which would require all state agencies, and the state of California state government is very, very large, would require all state agencies to utilize low emission natural gas. And similar to Virginia and Tennessee, it would provide instruction to the state Regulatory Utility Commission to allow for low emission natural gas to be used by utilities. So here we see in this graph once again the different types of tools that are being used from states across the country. Once again, if these are successful, other states may adopt these, and the federal government may look to these state policies as examples of policies that the federal government could adopt. For example, if the state of California policy was to go into effect, where state government agencies must use low methane emission gas, we might see the federal government taking on a similar policy for all federal government agencies. If we go to the next slide, please. So this is the big question. With regards to methane emissions, in the US, do we wait for regulations to kick in? And I think that we, across the variety or range of regulations on the federal government side, as well as the regulations that are starting to emerge on the state government side, we could see, were these regulations to go into effect immediately, we could see fairly significant methane emission reductions in those jurisdictions. I think the key consideration, however, is to what are those regulations going to apply, and when would those regulations take effect? And from looking at the first part of that question, to what will these regulations apply within the U.S., I think you've seen at the state level, of the 50 states, there are only a handful of states which are really actively engaging in state regulations. From a similar perspective at the federal government, from the federal government's perspective, the various policies will only apply to particular elements of the oil and gas sector. For example, the methane fee, which, as I noted before, will come into effect for those entities which are emitting above a certain threshold, that will likely have the successful outcome, result in the successful outcome of driving down methane emissions for those entities to which the regulation is applied. However, there is a very large portion of the oil and gas community, the smaller operators, to which the methane fee will not apply. In a similar vein, from a temporal perspective, many of the regulations which we just discussed are not going to come into effect for potentially a few months, up to 5 years from now. Now, methane, as we all know, is one of the most potent greenhouse gases, and it is imperative that methane emission reductions take place today, and that we don't wait the 6 months to 5 years for regulations to kick in. So what I would propose, and I think what MIQ advocates, is at the same time that regulations stand or may have the ability to drive down methane emissions, those are not going to take place, are not going to come into effect for quite a while. And in the immediate sense, as a bridging mechanism, certification creating low emission or resulting in low emission natural gas is a tool that is at our disposal right now, which can really drive down methane emissions today. And so what MIQ feels very strongly about is that market approaches using certified gas in combination with regulations is really the mix of tools that is necessary both today as well as 5 or 10 years into the future that we really need to embrace to drive down methane emissions. So with that, I will hand it over to the audience for any questions we might have.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for these insights and really great achievements in the last year and a half, because it's really impressive how much gas is already certified and what you come across with this registry and so on. But still, how to say it, it still seems like US driven or industry driven. And somehow I miss what is the first, let's put it that way, because first would be done regulation, and this is coming into EU, like to put obligation that actually you have to prove how good your natural gas is coming to Europe. And for that, actually, I would like to ask you how you see what Europe now in this stage can actually learn from US example, and how this other instruments and policies like CBAM, for example, can fit together with this certification, and what actually Europe should kind of do first, looking at the US.
Yeah, happy to look at that. And I just saw a question popping up from Muris. Yes, we'll definitely share the slides. That's absolutely fine. It's a very good question. So I think what's interesting in Europe is first of all, that regulation is not in place yet. And as Ben alluded, these things do take time. In Europe, what's currently being discussed is more geared towards the regulation of methane emissions inside the EU territory, which is obviously a smaller part of the gas consumption. The real challenge for Europe is going to be to deal with the imported methane emissions, the emissions caused by, take your pick of countries, just to name a couple, whatever, Nigeria, Qatar, US, and so on, Algeria, Norway, and so on. And some of them are clearly low methane emissions. I don't know, Norway is a well-documented case, but the other ones are a bit less clear there. And so now we're potentially in the land of how to deal with that in practical terms. And that's where we think Europe should seriously consider looking into schemes such as certification, which are designed for giving the information at the border of the methane emissions. A report is not going to do it. It will be challenged. It's not precise enough. But the main thing is you need to have the supply chain elements. And we hope that Europe will adopt that as a leading buyer of gas. And as Ben was saying, so for example, California is already looking into that as a concept. So California, when it says they want to look at certified gas as a user, California is not different than the EU in a way. It's a buyer of gas. It's an importer of gas. And so for me, it's not so much around should Europe deal with the imported methane emissions. As my first boss, I was working for BP at the time, he always says, it's not about what we want to do, it's how we do it. And that's the same thing here, is like, yes, it's great to talk about, we want methane emissions abroad to go down. The question is, how do you then do this? And so that gas is now available, that concept is now available. 18 months ago, it wasn't. 18 months, this was a concept. Now it's a reality, and we're looking to bring it to other countries. So what we also hope is that just like in the US, the industry started, we hope that maybe there will be some leading companies on this here, on this forum as well. You can start this now. You don't have, like Ben is saying, do we have to wait for the regulator, or do we start to create a mechanism that can work for all? So that's how I look at it. I'm seeing Miresis raise the, I don't
Yes,
know,
this is
or
what I
question.
wanted to say. So please, Mr. Zara, take the floor, because you are following very actively and you have a lot of questions.
Thank you. Thank you, George and Ben, for this great presentation. Just wanted to react to your last point, George, because actually the pending regulation, and it's likely to be issued, well, the ambition of the EC is to be issued for the next COP, so that will be end of this year. So that's not, so it's just tomorrow. And in all versions, you have a clear something which is pretty much aligned, because gas imported into the EU will have to declare the intensity, and that information will have to be provided to the importers by those who sell the gas. So actually this, what Carolina mentioned, like a dissymmetry, is just a dissymmetry between supplier and buyer, and it's pretty natural. And it makes sense that I would say it provides cutting edge tools to US producers to supply to European importers the information which is actually required by the regulation. And just to be more specific, this information will be made available in a public transparency database registry, which will be published with the volumes imported by the buyer, the producer will be identified. So all this will be public knowledge. So actually the path is pretty clear, and I think that what you're presenting is pretty aligned. So there is one thing which is not, obviously there are uncertainties because the trilogues, so the discussions between the European Parliament, Council, which is the assembly of the representatives of the executive powers in the member states, and the European Commission. So these three will discuss because they have each their own view. And typically the Parliament has put like a threshold of 0.2% on upstream. So there is a huge ambiguity in upstream, because is upstream production, or is it production plus gathering and boosting plus processing? So those segments of the value chain could be seen very well in one of your slides. And if you have 0.2% just in production, or for the three of those, that's not exactly the same. And it will be a lot more selective if it includes the three segments rather than if it includes production only. So that's a little bit, yes, uncertain. And but otherwise, the whole idea is not only to get that information, and actually the rationale was not to regulate on the mid and downstream facilities in Europe. It was just as it regulates on those, to have a good reason to ask what happens upstream. So we have our own producers, but those provide a small amount, and Norway has had probably the world's strictest regulations for 1 or 2 decades already. So I would say they're not, they're more of an example than a counterexample.
Well, I fully agree there. If everybody would be managing it like Norway, we wouldn't have this forum, I think, and we wouldn't have started MIQ. They're clearly way ahead there.
No, thank you for bringing this more insights on process in EU. and how this all kind of fits together with importers and suppliers. But still, I mean, while waiting for regulation and raising actually awareness of methane emissions as an issue, still a lot of actually uncertainty and a lot of questions. Somebody would like to take floor, or Erwin, you would like to take a floor? Sorry.
I should unmute myself.
Okay, okay. So it was by chance. So I just want to actually to say lot of questions still, like, okay, now we have certification system in place. This is MIQ. No, actually we have a reporting and monitoring system in place, like OGMP 2.0, and companies should go in that way. So what would be the difference and how these two match actually together?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, one that we get asked quite a lot, actually. So I think first I want to start with the common goals that both OGMP and us, we have, both trying to address methane emissions. We both realize it's like a huge problem, and I always express it as it's the same as all the cars on the road, and that's the methane emissions purely from oil and gas. And when I started this 4 years ago, I was actually amazed that we weren't addressing this, whilst we were clearly paying a lot of attention to building EVs, and this is the same size of what we can address, and much easier to address in a way. Then both OGMP and ourselves, we've got a huge focus on the need for involving methane technology, and whether that's with flyovers or with continuous monitoring or satellites. That's a more technical debate now, but the key here is to solve methane emissions, you need to have more accurate representations of what the methane emissions are, and that involves methane technology. So that's absolutely key. Where the differences in approach are coming for is more the methodology, let's say, and the purpose. And they're both related, I would argue. So the methodology is that the difference being that MIQ certifies at an asset level, at a facility level. So we don't look only at the company level initially. So we don't look at, I don't know, Exxon Global or Shell Global as a report. We look at their individual assets. Now, obviously, if a company does all their assets, then you can add it back up to what the company represents. And the reason is that we believe it's key that the buyers, the sellers, the traders, the actual decision makers on a daily basis have the information, and they trade with a facility. Nobody trades with Exxon Global. You trade with, I don't know, LNG export terminal in some country somewhere, or you buy from a specific oil field. So that's where the transparency has to start. It's obviously slightly more work involved because you now look at those individual assets. Then the second one is a difference in approach to audits. As I said initially, we use independent qualified technical auditors, and they go thoroughly through all the details. It's not a desktop exercise. They have to go visit the sites, and that's because methane science is key. And so this is all linked to the purpose, where the purpose the way we look at this is for the buyers, the sellers, the traders, the commercial people, the negotiators. They need that information, and they need it across the supply chain. And that's what MIQ is being designed for. It's being designed for dealing with the complexities of a US supply chain. It's being designed for dealing with the complexities of a global LNG supply chain, where you can have up to 7 different segments that you might need to add up. And I think OGMP is a more annual reporting, which is designed for different purposes. It's designed for the purposes, for example, of reporting as a company, or at institutional level reporting. And so it's got different audiences that it caters for. But I think the two go hand in hand. And we do get asked the question sometimes by people, should I do OGMP or should I do MIQ? And we say, just do both, because the underlying work, there is a lot of similarities. And so the extra work involved to do both is actually not that incremental in the end. And because they serve different purposes, you then get both purposes in one go.
Thank you. That was very clear. And I see Mr. Zerina immediately had another question in his mind.
Yeah,
Please.
thank you, Carolina. Not so much a question, more of a let's say a comment to what George just said. When you're saying actually OGMP, at least as I understood, provides there's a huge difference between the data they get and the data they publish, because they get indeed data at asset level. If you look at the template, at the OGMP2 template, you have the three types of emission: the fugitive, vented, incomplete combustion, and then for each value chain segment, you have these three types in each of the major facilities. So in the end, each operator will report, indeed, there's some freedom to report possibly either one, if I take a midstream operator, either all compressor stations together or individually per compressor station, but still you get some more refined granularity. But okay, just to mention that there is probably even more similarity. Indeed, it's highlighting what you said, that once you've done the work, it serves both purposes. Probably it would do a lot of good to everyone that you even more closely align the two reporting or data gathering frameworks. So that's one comment. The other comment is back to the measurements. Actually, GERG, so that stands for the European Gas Research Group, is currently finalizing a project on reconciling site level and source level measurements. In other terms, or what before would have been called top-down and bottom-up. Well, that shows that the importance of uncertainty levels, and I think that's one of the hidden topics which makes things not so easy, because some of these technologies have really high uncertainties, way larger than what's used, I would say, in transactional metrology. So that has to be accounted for. So when you try to put all these together, well, in this particular case where we addressed a simple compressor station in Belgium, actually the source level, the sum of the source level emissions was larger than the one of the top-down on the site level emissions. So I think it's there has to be caution, because quite a few times that was the, I would say, the reason why asking you about what are the measurement, what measurement type, and you mentioned it was flyovers. I think it's really worth having a separate discussion, indeed, to go into more detail, probably inform you a little bit also what GERG is doing. So this can happen very well. We can invite you in GERG and have a GERG methane emissions meeting, and we can have a conversation, interestingly, I think, for everyone.
No, definitely would love to join that, because I mean, reconciliation, just to use that word, that's now taking place in practice on all the facilities we've got going in the US, and that's taking place on a quarterly basis. That needs to be checked, and so we're using different guidelines for that. But at the same time, so what's interesting is that we've because, as you know, reconciliation has been discussed a lot in forums and stays sometimes quite highly theoretical. We've started doing that in practice and see the complexities behind it. And so knowledge is changing on a monthly basis on what works, what doesn't work. And it's really down to the specifics on each of the technologies and how does it reconcile. So it's a super interesting field, and it's one of the ones that we we think makes what we're doing quite unique by imposing basically that reconciliation process between the theory and then the practice coming out of the measurements.
Okay, so then consider yourself invited to such a meeting.
Okay, great.
Right after the summer holidays, if you obviously.
I am glad that we actually established the direct cooperation in front of the cameras. So, and I see that there will be more results actually to be shown after summer. I mean that we are not at the end of exploring topic of methane emissions. Actually, I prepared more questions, but but now we are at the end of our 1 hour of a webinar. And I would like to thank to our presenters from MIQ, to all of you for participation and having interest, because it's really from US, mainly Europe, but actually we also have participants from Japan. So I believe that they found interesting this certification scheme for them as well. What to say? With this, we are entering into the summer break. So I wish you really nice, relaxing, and fruitful summer. We will think about new topics for autumn, and we will try to continue with Methane Mondays. Let's say late September, early October, and then let's see what will come next. So with that, have a nice afternoon, nice week, and nice summer.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting us. It's been a pleasure. Have a great summer, all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Enjoy summer.
Enjoy the summer.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.